Welcome to the 3D Players podcast, where we explore personalization in healthcare through advancements in 3D technology. We'll talk to leaders championing more predictable and sustainable patient care. I'm Sebastian de Boot, and I'm joined by my co-host Pieter Slagmolen. Today's discussion will focus on 3D printing at the point of care, and we have Andy Christensen as our guest. Andy started his career in 3D printing in 1993, and after 7 years, founded his own company, Medical Modeling, which was acquired by 3D Systems in 2014. Since then, he's been instrumental in the community to drive the adoption of 3D printing in healthcare, and last year he received the prestigious Innovator Award of the Additive Manufacturing User Group. He currently serves as the chair of the RSNA 3D Printing Special Interest Group and holds the title of Adjunct Professor in the Department of Radiology at the University of Cincinnati. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Sebastian. Great to be with you. Hello, Peter.
So, Andy, 30 years in medical 3D printing. How did this actually get started?
Yeah, gosh, 30 years goes by like a blink. So my experience, I did, you mentioned starting medical modeling in 2000, but medical modeling had a little bit of a pre-start several years earlier, and I got into it through a family connection. My father was a surgeon and an entrepreneurial guy, and he had a focus in oral surgery and became an investor in a company in Texas, actually, that would later go away. But that company invested in one of the earliest 3D printers. It was an SLA 250. I could almost pull out the model number, which was something like 93010203, something like that. But that 3D printer, its purpose was to produce models of anatomy. And back then it was hard. You guys and Fried von Crayen definitely know how hard it was. But the purpose was to make models to help patients that had major issues in their temporomandibular joint area. And so that was kind of the initial emphasis. When that company kind of dissolved, the technology ended up coming to Colorado, and I was finishing school in 1996. I have a business degree, and I'd always had kind of an interest after seeing it years earlier and kind of seeing what it could do. And so that became my kind of basis, was in running that little effort in 1996 that would eventually turn into medical modeling. And I was able to buy the company and refound it in 2000 as medical modeling, and kind of built from there through to 2014 when it was sold to 3D Systems. So that's a little bit of how I got my first experience in seeing the technology back in the 90s.
Like a family history almost that you rolled into this.
Yeah. The earliest is the oral surgery connection, because, oral and maxillofacial surgery around the world was really the first big adopter of these technologies for medicine. So it wouldn't surprise me that some of Materialize's earliest cases too were in oral and maxillofacial surgery. And even I've enjoyed kind of going back pre-3D printing to some of the earliest visualization of CT scan data. And some of the folks in places like Kiel, Germany, and Vienna, Austria, where they were milling models out of foam from a medical imaging data set, a lot of those early applications were also oral surgeons that were doing this work for jaw tumors or orthognathic surgery and other things. So interestingly, the oral surgery component just sort of fell into place and was a good place to start, because those surgeons kind of got it.
Actually, in our introduction, we used the term 3D printing at the point of care, which I think in an oral surgery is also a big thing maybe nowadays. So could you maybe describe for our listeners what this entails? Point of care, what it means for you?
Yeah, so, really, historically, these services were provided by companies to hospitals, where a hospital or a surgeon would send out a data set, and a company, an industry, would make the model and send it back to the surgeon. What's happened over the last, I'll say 10 or 15 years, is there's been an effort to kind of insource some of the production of those models. And so you would find either surgeons or departments like the Department of Radiology buying 3D printers and producing in-house inside of a hospital or a clinic or an office the same model that they used to buy from industry. And I think what's led to it, it's kind of an interesting thing. How did that happen? But I think you find in all areas surgeons that are kind of tinkerers that really like the concept of playing with tools and data. And it's not like that's most of the surgeons, but a few surgeons. So you'd find those kind of early adopters that said, hey, I can now buy a 3D printer. Most of those would probably have started with a filament-based extrusion 3D printer maybe 10 years ago. And over the course of time, the quality of the lower cost printers, the lower cost stereolithography printers, for example, in the last 10 years sometime, all of that's made it more accessible. So I think you'd find people that were like, hey, I've got some imaging expertise or I've got surgical expertise, and now I can go buy a couple $1,000 3D printer and can kind of put the two together. So I think that's kind of how it started. I think what's interesting to see is over time how it's kind of morphed is that you now see in the US for sure, if you had to pick one place in the hospital where you're seeing the most uptick to bring in a point of care solution, it's radiology. Mm-hmm. And radiology is a great fit because of the fact that they own the imaging, they're experts at the imaging, and they're also a service, like a centralized service within the hospital. So they are servicing every surgical specialty in the hospital. So I think those two things kind of combine to make radiology a good fit. But what's happened, what I find interesting and kind of fascinating today is once put the printer and the technology in the hospital and you say, I'm going to service orthopedic surgery, and they need bone models, fairly easy. But all of a sudden you get this kind of creep to other areas. And so you'd find places like the Mayo Clinic that are one of the leaders in doing this work, they now have like 20 surgical specialties ordering models for cases. From an industry standpoint, it would be hard to imagine you could do that, but once it's there and the tool's in-house, anybody and everybody can see it and try to utilize it.
I think you described quite well how the technology became accessible and where it's been going. One thing that's not entirely clear is the why of that. Why do they want to do it within the hospital? Because if they had a reliable service they could get from companies, why did they want to insource this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer is probably multifactorial. I would think that time and cost probably play some role in it, maybe for certain types of things. A lot of this technology has been expensive forever. So when industry sells a model to a hospital or a surgeon, it's not like it's a couple $100. So I think the fact that the price tag is fairly high, combined with if people kind of see like, well, we're used to paying $2,000 for a model, and here we know we can buy a printer for $3,000 and we can somebody's got the time to spend 2 hours doing image processing. They, in their mind, kind of can potentially justify it and say, look, we think we can do it cheaper. I'm not totally sure that's accurate when you look at the whole picture. Can you actually be cheaper doing it in-house? But if you're a high volume center of using something, I think that potentially makes sense. You'd find others talking about turnaround time, and turnaround time for things like models is fairly routinely done all over the world, and it's probably not taking a lot of time. I mean, even in my own experience, we could turn models around in a day to a week was probably pretty typical. So I'm not sure turnaround time, but I know facilities talk about turnaround time. The third part that I think is interesting, and especially as you get this kind of scope creep beyond just making models of bony anatomy, which is where a lot of it started, was just models of bones. And it turns out making models of bones is probably the easiest thing you could do. Imaging and segmentation-wise, bony anatomy is pretty easy to pull out. What gets more interesting and complicated, though, is looking at different pathologies and tumors and problems. And when you start thinking about all over different areas of the body, and say you've got something in the pancreas or something in the liver, and you need to determine what's normal versus abnormal anatomy, their accuracy is kind of an issue that some would point to and saying, look, industry doesn't know the pancreas very well. It isn't an application. So here, if we're going to model the vasculature and a tumor mass and the pancreas itself, we need to have that expertise as radiologists or surgeons. Industry doesn't have it, and thus accuracy becomes a big piece. So I think those are a couple of reasons. I'm not sure what maybe the biggest reason would be.
Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense. Maybe personally, because you come from a pure service company, Like, what sparked you to go into that direction?
Yeah, I was thinking of that too. Myself, even today, I kind of say I have an academic hat and I have kind of a non-academic hat. I think going back, I mean, my whole history is in running a company, up to 2014. My bent was I am a company owner trying to sell services, help surgeons, help patients by selling services around this personalization area. It included models and guides and implants. I sold the business to 3D Systems in 2014. I had a plan to stay on for several years, but as many of these things go, I left after 11 months because I just could kind of see that I wanted to be doing other things and it wasn't, for me, maybe the perfect fit. I'm very happy for the company and the technology and the employees. I'm very happy that, the fit's there and they've continued to do well, to grow and expand and stay in a leading position. For me, after leaving, I kind of had a choice. What do I do next? And so right around the same time, the Radiological Society of North America and the radiologists, which is a large radiology group, and I'm privileged to be chair of the special interest group this year on 3D printing, but that group in general was starting to see a lot of interest in the radiology field in 3D printing. And so over the years, my home clinically for myself, it would have been in areas like oral and maxillofacial surgery and craniofacial surgery and orthopedic surgery. Kind of going forward, I saw, just an opportunity to play a role in what was going on in radiology as they tried to do basically what we did in industry. It was kind of like taking me back 10 years prior, 15 years prior. They were trying to do that. So I think how I got there is just by, being out there and listening and seeing what's going on. I do feel very privileged to kind of be contributing to what's going on and what's next there, because some of it was old hat. I knew imaging and image segmentation and different modeling techniques and virtual surgical planning and templating and these things. What's interesting, so hospitals and radiology needed to kind of figure that out. What's interesting is moving beyond the practical tools and workflows to like, how do you make a business of this in a hospital environment? And specifically the concept of kind of sustainability. So today, my own feeling for where we need to go and what the future holds is trying to move to reimbursement being a more common practice for these procedures performed in a hospital environment.
Okay, so I think it's interesting to hear that getting involved into radiology, and I assume that that's like the early days when the seeds were planted for what's now the special interest group. And I've seen you within this group really breaking down a lot of the barriers for 3D printing. Looking back or even towards the future, like what do you consider as the biggest barrier when it comes to, hospitals that want to do 3D printing in-house?
I think the biggest barrier to 3D printing work is probably the financial side of it, and not just finding enough money to buy a printer, whether it's a $3,000 printer or a $100,000 printer, but really creating the infrastructure, having the right people and having full-time people dedicated to an area, which for hospitals is challenging to just take on a new project. So let's say this is kind of a new technology and to have that not really have an income source. To date, hospitals that have implemented these technologies in-house are doing it mostly because they feel like it's better for patient care. That's the reason that hospitals are doing this work. It helps the surgeons, it helps provide better care for the patients. What it doesn't have associated with it, though, is kind of standard reimbursement, which in the U.S. is guided by some coding nomenclature that's then tied to a value, and that value that the CMS and the Medicare system kind of set that many of the private pay insurers in the U.S. would take and pay based on these values. And forever, 3D printing enabled technologies for personalization of surgery have not had these codes and any associated values. So what it means is hospitals purchasing equipment and setting up shop to make 3D printed parts are doing it without any reimbursement, generally speaking. So I think that's one of the big barriers. It hasn't stopped a lot of people from doing it. The benefit to the patient is great enough that these people are doing it anyway, even without money associated with it. But Sustainably, I don't think it's sustainable to not have it it needs reimbursement to kind of be sustainable for the long term.
The reimbursement, how close or how far are we?
I'd say we're on a path. People used to ask me, what are you doing or whatever. I said, well, I'm a guy on a path, moving forward. From a reimbursement standpoint, we're kind of on a trajectory now that I think is going to be successful and has been successful. So the general premise, I guess if we rewind about 4 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago now, is that the RSNA was interested in trying to establish what are called CPT codes. So the American Medical Association sets out the nomenclature for physician-provided services, and that is called current procedural technology, CPT. They're the ones to kind of set the nomenclature. And so you first have to go petition them to set codes. And there's several different types of codes. The ones that are primarily known by people are what are called Category 1 CPT codes. And these are for technologies that are kind of established with an established kind of value proposition for why they should actually be paid. The RSNA group collaborated with the American College of Radiology, so ACR, and ACR does a lot of this work, is very active and obviously in radiology and kind of major stakeholder for the financial aspects of what goes on in radiology. Between the RSNA and the ACR, they decided that we didn't yet have enough data kind of out there in the world to prove that we knew exactly what kind of a code we wanted and how it should be reimbursed. So we went down a different pathway, and we went still through the AMA, but we got what are called Category 3 CPT codes. So the process was you have to petition, go before a panel. The panel has to vote on whether they think this is worthwhile and whether it's necessary. And so that happened circa, I'm going to lose track of the dates here a little bit, but let's say 2017 that happened. And in 2018, roughly maybe a year later, codes were approved. And this is the first time that, codes have been established for any of this work. And the codes said anatomic models. There were 2 codes for anatomic models and 2 codes for what are called, in this nomenclature, anatomic guides, which would be the surgical guides and templates and other things. Just getting these Category 3 codes established was a major win. This is something I tried in industry for years to do back in the mid-2000s and failed. I had 3 attempts at establishing codes, and all of them failed for numerous reasons. But so personally, I was very excited to see these codes get established. Where we are and what the path is the Category 3 codes are called temporary codes. They are also called T codes, and their purpose is to kind of collect data. So they're good in that they set nomenclature. They aren't as good because they don't have a value associated with them yet. And so we're working now to collect data to progress to a Category 1 CPT code application, which likely happens in the next 2 years that we kind of make that move. After that, there's a process that still involves a couple of years. So we're probably on the whole continuum, we've probably got 4 or 5 years potentially before Category 1 CPT codes for some of this work are in effect and live. So it's quite a process. One of the things I'll point out is that supporting that effort, the RSNA 3D Printing Special Interest Group and the ACR established what's called a registry. And this is another, I think, great step for the industry, in that a registry was established to collect data from institutions that are doing this work internally. And so ACR has several registries in the imaging field that are set up over the last years, and they run and effectively gather like millions of data points for some of these registries. So ACR knows registries and helped us set up a 3D printing registry so that hospitals can join and submit data on how they're using 3D printing, what they're doing with it, what tools they're using, and all of that. This is an important data point for us going forward because it'll help show what's called widespread adoption or widespread use of these tools through different institutions.
I've always wondered, and I don't get the answer entirely from your story, is how will reimbursement cope with probably wide differences in value for what 3D printing is going to deliver? I mean, if you place a hip implant, it's pretty straightforward. So it's probably a very similar value for all patients. But if you're talking about 3D printing and you're going to be creating a bone model for a fracture versus doing a big anatomical model for conjoined twin surgery, for example, the value and cost are both very diverse. So how do you see that being handled in that reimbursement pathway?
Part of the answer, I think, comes from the registry. I think what people will want to know is how much time, let me back up, cost in general could be equated to a few different pieces of the puzzle. One of those is specific for CPT. These are things that have physician time associated with them. So one of the reasons why CPT is appropriate here is that these models are being made in a hospital environment with the oversight of physicians. And that could be surgeons, could be radiologists, and others. So when looking at cost, we're trying to break down how much physician time is involved, because there's a physician component of the reimbursement. And then there's also what's called a technical component of the reimbursement. And the technical component could include things like the 3D printers and the materials and the software. Mm-hmm. It also would include the technologist or engineer time used for segmentation. Somebody that's not a physician, but is skilled in doing this work. So all of that kind of on the technical side. So part of why the registry exists is to collect that data, to say that the physician time for these cases on average is 30 minutes or an hour, whatever it is, and the technical time and cost equals X. Looking at that will give kind of a data. It won't be maybe the total picture, but be some good data points about what's realistic in the field and what tools people are using. The other piece that ties into how much could be paid and for what procedures it could be paid for ties into this concept of clinical appropriateness. So you can imagine, like, somebody goes and breaks their arm or stubs their toe or whatever, all kinds of medical issues. You can imagine that making a model for some of those things, for all of those things, isn't necessary. And we would all say that's silly, like that's a waste of money. It's not even going to help. In the field, generally, there's this concept of clinical appropriateness, and it falls to groups. So the RSNA, specifically in this area, the RSNA Special Interest Group on 3D printing has published and will continue to update guidelines for clinical appropriateness for models. The way it works is that you break it into different categories of cases. So there'd be like cardiac modeling, and that may be even broken into pediatric versus adult. You'd have craniomaxillofacial, you'd have neurosurgery, you'd have GU and other areas, breast. These areas specifically, we would kind of dive into and look at diagnoses for medical conditions, and when either diagnoses for medical conditions and or surgical procedures. And then you'd start to review of the literature, the scientific literature, plus expert opinion. You would go through and start to kind of create a ranking scale. And the way we've done it is a 1 to 9 scale. So 1 being not very appropriate and 9 being really appropriate. And you spend time going through all of these diagnoses and procedures, and you end up kind of creating a list that's backed up by science, like you want to have evidence, but it says that for a simple fracture of the face, this might be rated a 3. Not very appropriate, not totally inappropriate, but not very appropriate. But for a complex fracture of the face, maybe it takes it up to a 7 or an 8. It says it's definitely appropriate. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but talking about why something would be paid and how much would be paid for it, I think there's a couple of pieces that go in, and both kind of the time element, the cost, plus what is and isn't clinically appropriate for a specific case will both hopefully eventually equal value. There's another kind of concept here that gets a little complicated, but when those CPT codes are established in a Category 1 CPT code, they also go to another group before they're released that actually does the valuing. And this group is a bunch of physician groups have a member of their group that comes and sits in a panel of maybe, I think it's 20 or 24 physicians. And this panel is called the RUC. It's developing, it puts a number on it that's called a relative value unit. An RVU is established for each of these codes. And interestingly, if we want to get a code established for making a model, and it's going to be $1,000 and reimbursed at $1,000, it means that around that table of these 24 physicians, which are all different groups, all different areas of specialty, somebody's going to have to give up $1,000 for the $1,000 to come and be allocated to the 3D printing part. So there's kind of a zero-sum aspect to this, which I find quite interesting. When it gets to that point, there's a lot of discussion about what things are going away and what things should be invested in for the future.
Sounds like quite an intricate puzzle that you're laying there on your path, but certainly valuable. I also like the appropriateness criteria. I assume that it creates value for hospitals who still are at the start of their 3D printing activities to kind of immediately work on identify what are the most useful, valuable cases to work on.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think if you were starting out and didn't know anything but said, hey, I've got some interest in this area and where do I start in a hospital, I would go pull those appropriateness documents and start looking for everything that's a 7 or 8 or a 9, the really highly appropriate things, and say, let's forget everything that's low, but let's shoot for the high end, the very appropriate work.
Yeah, great tip for some of our listeners who might be starting.
Yeah, and there's still a lot to do. Like these documents are they need to be living documents that get updated every year to 3 years, because over time there is more literature, and some things that maybe we thought were really appropriate maybe now aren't so appropriate for some reason. So ratings could change. The literature, the body of literature, hopefully will keep increasing. The literature will prove some things more appropriate and probably prove some things less appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. One of the other important pieces of the puzzle that we haven't laid in this episode is the regulatory piece. For companies who want to put a medical device in the market and offer this to hospitals, they need to go through a very stringent process to make sure that whatever they sell is safe for patients and works effectively. Now that hospitals are starting to produce basically their own medical devices, like how does the FDA, for example, look at that? Are they getting nervous? Are they, an ally along your path? How does that go?
It's clear that in the future, some of the work that's done at the point of care will have direct oversight by the FDA. If we back up, so I'm trying to think of where to start on the timeline. If we go back, some of these tools from models and such that are maybe moderate to low risk devices have been made for years, and companies like Materialize and Medical Modeling and others followed regulations. And like you say, for industry to sell these services to hospitals, they need to go through certain regulatory pathways. Over time, that's gotten clearer and clearer as to what those pathways are. For things like anatomic models and surgical guides that are tied to a surgical plan, those things in the US are class 2 devices that would require a 510K to be submitted prior to marketing those devices. So if you're a company and you want to sell something to a hospital, it seems pretty clear. It's only been, I'm trying to think of all the steps, the first 3D printed implants that were made cleared by the FDA was in 2010. We were privileged to play a role in some of the first clearances there, but that's not that long ago. It's only a dozen years ago when before that there were 0 3D printed implants that were cleared in the US. I think the FDA has been a great collaborator in this area. Many people historically would say the FDA has kind of stood in the way of innovation in some way by putting up barriers. The barriers they put up, if you call them barriers, again in air quotes, they really are focused on patient safety. So these are barriers that have a very good reason for existing. It's about you and I walking into a surgeon's office and knowing that what he's going to do for us is safe and effective for what we're going to do. Over time, the FDA's held a couple of different important meetings. Starting back in 2014, there was a great workshop the FDA put on that had about 500 people at it in wherever it was in the DC area. This led to the FDA creating a guidance document specifically for additive manufactured medical devices. This was really targeted at medical device companies and not so much at point of care installations. But you could tell as things were moving and as people were talking more about point of care, so say from 2015 and forward, the FDA was increasingly interested in trying to address this area and what it meant, because you're right, historically, if industry is selling these products to hospitals, FDA regulates the industry. They don't regulate the users. So the hospitals and the surgeons aren't under the auspices of the FDA. I think what's seen to be different is that now you could buy a 3D printer and you could make all kinds of things in a hospital environment. And we're talking here about models and guides primarily, but you also see, and I think we'll see some more hospitals talking about metal implants and actually making implants inside the hospital. So there seems easy to think that these are permanent devices in a moderate to high risk level that are going to be in the body. They've got all kinds of different considerations for strength and biocompatibility and whatever. The FDA is going to care if those devices are now made in the hospital, much as they care that the devices that are made by industry. So the RSNA held a meeting with the FDA in 2017, and at that meeting talked a lot about anatomic models and maybe a little bit about surgical guides. During that meeting, the talk was about the model itself and what are called diagnostic use anatomic models, which are kind of, if you're going to make a model and it's going to be used for patient care, the FDA says that is a diagnostic use part. So if you're going to sell a diagnostic use or make a diagnostic use part, the FDA said, here's the pathway. And they laid out a new pathway that actually materialized, was the first to kind of go down this pathway of clearance for a product, which was the Mimics imprint software. So 2017, the FDA said, this is how you should do it. Early 2018, Materialize, somewhere in there, gets clearance for Mimics imprint, which is a system that includes the software to do the image processing, as well as validated hardware and material components. It said that you could make a model in a hospital using a X, Y, and Z printer with X, Y, and Z materials for X, Y, and Z applications, so say heart or craniomaxillofacial, and that those parts that came out of that printer would be diagnostic use anatomic models, which was pretty cool and kind of laid out a framework for, I think, more of what we'll see in the future. It's still left, there's a lot of ambiguity in this area. So over time, hopefully the gray areas are getting less gray. But what happened after that is that the FDA has since held several discussions over the last few years that led to a discussion paper being introduced in December of 2021. So the FDA put out a discussion paper on 3D printing at the point of care. This is a long-winded answer to your question, but it's important, I think, to the future. This paper laid out 3 scenarios of how the regulatory aspect of this whole equation could work. And they laid out 3. So the first one is hospitals using a tool that industry has created as a system. And they use a term that is coming from kind of an international group consortium of regulatory bodies called Medical Device Production System, MDPS. Concept of an MDPS is that it's a system that industry would put together that includes hardware, software, materials, know-how, and documentation. And this system would be cleared by industry and sold to a hospital. And its purpose would be to allow a hospital to take data in and output something that, again, is a diagnostic use part. So the FDA says if you're using an MDPS and you're a hospital, you have no regulatory burden. The regulatory burden is on the company that clears the MDPS. Mm-hmm. So that was scenario 1. Scenario 2 was this concept of co-locating a manufacturer, a medical device company, at the point of care. So here you'd actually have a company put a satellite facility or a facility next to or inside of a hospital. In the past, this area, the FDA has pointed to a collaboration between the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York and a company called Lima Corporate from Italy. And Lima is placing a manufacturing, I'm going to call it cell, within the Hospital for Special Surgery. And it's co-located, so it's there. You've obviously got, good ability to cross-collaborate between the groups. And the regulatory burden there falls to the company, not to the hospital. So the company clears products, has its own FDA registration and all of that, and they function that way, kind of co-located. The third area which is interesting, is that the hospital, if there aren't products that are out there that they can use, they want to develop their own thing, and it's of a certain risk level, the hospital would become the medical device company and submit for registration and listing and submit pre-market clearances as needed for products they want to sell. So this would make the hospital take on all of the responsibility of a traditional medical device manufacturer. I think the future will be interesting. Where all that's leading is that will lead to, over the next, I'll say, year to 2 years, we should see a guidance document come out from the FDA about point of care 3D printing and what it means and who has responsibility for what. But a lot of interesting moving parts there.
I think it's probably very comforting to know that the regulators are very much involved. And when I hear you talk, it feels like they are an ally, but that as a patient, we also don't need to be too much worried. I think that's probably a good thing. I was triggered by the fact that you mentioned some hospitals are looking into metal printing, where today it's mostly models and that being printed at the hospital. How far do you see this go in the future? You believe, for example, that printing metal implants in a hospital, is it actually a good idea?
I think it's sort of inevitable that it will happen some. So kind of the question is, how often will it happen? There have been a couple of institutions in the US, and I know around the world, talk about implementing metal 3D printing inside a hospital. Question of whether it's a good idea or not is actually a good question, and I don't have a pat answer, but I would say that in my own experience, metal 3D printing has a level of complexity that's quite a bit higher than any of these other 3D printing technologies. The machines and such are more complicated. The safety measures surrounding the stuff are more complicated. The kind of pre and post processing steps needed are definitely more complicated. So you think of like what you need for a metal 3D printed part with things like stress relieving, different types of heat treatments and stress relieving and things like hipping, and then further kind of machining of components, which many 3D printed implants get machined to some degree after they're printed as well for mating tolerances and whatnot. I think all that to say, it's not a little thing. And like for a hospital to get involved and say, we want to do metal 3D printing, they've got to have a really good reason to do it and know that it's probably a multi-million-dollar commitment. So as opposed to saying, well, we're going to buy something for 50 grand in terms of the kit, here they're kind of biting off a lot. I think given the complexity of it, I don't think we're going to see a lot of places do it because it is complex, it is difficult. I believe that the FDA is making it pretty clear. I mean, that's probably to me the clearest area that if you're going to do titanium 3D printing for implants inside of a hospital, you need to be thinking of yourself as a medical device manufacturer with a full-fledged QMS and all the product clearances that you'd need too. And the good and the bad, I mean, the way the U.S. regulatory system works, product clearances are in these kind of silos under indications. So depending on your indication, whether it's for even if you made a bone plate that was the same bone plate for a fracture in the jaw versus a fracture in the hand versus a fracture in the lower leg, all of those typically would require separate clearances from the FDA. So it means that there's a lot of regulatory work that goes behind trying to set up something that you could use in a hospital for more than a couple of things. All that said, I think we're seeing people try to do it. I'm sure there will be some interesting use cases that come up, but my guess is based on the complexity and the regulatory complexity, it probably keeps people away from doing this in the hospital very much. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, one other piece that sort of ties in is this concept of some kind of a hybrid approach where you've got hospitals playing more of a role in maybe the design of a part. And then instead of having all that technology in-house to output that part, let's talk about implants again. Maybe there's a way where industry and the hospital facility are kind of working together in a way that allows for design to happen at the hospital and production to happen in industry, which historically isn't the way the regulatory system isn't set up really for doing that much. So most of it, the design and the production are kind of coupled together, and the medical device company houses and owns all of that. But you could see maybe some hybrid component here coming about where you could see the hospital playing a role where it's useful and still not having to implement all these things in-house.
In one of our previous conversations, we talked about 3D printing in a more regenerative medicine context. And I remember you said, well, one, it's far out, but on the other hand, you also said point of care will play a crucial role in that. And I didn't really fully capture why. Why is point of care going to play a crucial role when we do 3D printing in regenerative medicine?
I think first off, 3D printing is a key manufacturing technology for the regenerative medicine applications. Kind of the ability to put certain materials or cells or growth factors in specific places. You can think of like voxels in a cube, and putting cells and tissue structures and tissue types and growth factors in specific places. 3D printing will be an excellent tool, and already I think is a workhorse tool in the development that's going on today. So that seems clear. Why point of care will be interesting? My own view is that some of those things won't likely travel well. So part of it may have to do with just the transport of things. And I think a lot of these things in the future, you could see using the patient's cells to somehow seed these components, whether that's taking a scaffold and seeding it, or whether that's actually directly depositing patient cells into a 3D printed part that will be maybe incubated and kind of matured before they can put it into the patient. I think for a few of those reasons, to me, it seems a lot like stem cell work when they for today, some of the stem cell therapies for, say, osteoarthritis, where you would go and have some of your cells harvested and they would be multiplied, duplicated physically over the course of some period of time before they're then put back into your body. To me, it seems like there will be a play for point of care to be, quite actively involved. What that looks like, I'm not sure. Even in the FDA's most recent discussion paper and some of the work that the FDA has been talking about in the last couple of months, they have definitely said that all they're looking at right now are things that are medical device related and not some of these other biologic areas, which are handled typically in a different part of the FDA than deals with some of the implant devices. So I'm very pro. I'm definitely bullish on regenerative medicine and the impact it'll play over the next decades in reconstruction of the body in all kinds of different ways. I think that it'll have a big impact.
For the point of care transition, a lot of that was driven by the hospitals who were motivated to do that. How do medical device companies actually react to this trend? Do they see this as a threat or as an opportunity? Or how should they react?
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of watch the different stakeholders in this area, because you can imagine that traditional medical device manufacturers are somewhat interested in what's going on and sort of feel like that even today, for things like anatomic models and surgical guides, hospitals could be making these things for their own use without any regulatory oversight from the FDA, for instance. And in the US, maybe everywhere, but in the US for sure, this concept of the practice of medicine is very kind of clear, and basically what it says is that a surgeon or a physician can provide healthcare for the patient in any way they see fit. If the surgeon or physician have appropriate training and appropriate credentialing from a facility like a hospital where they can provide care for the patient any way they see fit. So this is why you'd find surgeons deciding to use certain devices off-label, because the FDA clears things and gives the company an indication for use that says you can use this product for this reason. But the surgeon, if that product's legally marketed, that surgeon can actually take and use that product however, he can use it for something else. So say it's, again, the bone plate example, and it's a plate for the face, and he's working on somebody's hand and knows that it's going to work perfectly. He could use that plate and he could use it in an off-label way from a medical device standpoint, but he's doing his work under the practice of medicine. So today that work goes on, and if industry wanted to sell a model or a guide to a hospital, they would have to get a 510K as it's laid out today. But if a hospital just wants to do that themselves, they don't have to do anything. Already you could tell industry was like, well, that doesn't seem quite fair. There's a fairness aspect. There's also kind of a patient safety and all aspect too, where going through those FDA submissions makes you really lock down processes and have really robust protocols in place for making a safe device, which you wouldn't necessarily those just don't happen, in a hospital environment. Those just don't happen. So I think looking forward, let's see, what would I say? Again, back to this FDA discussion paper from December of 2021, they opened it up for public comment. So you can go find the paper online to download. That same place, you can go look at public comments that have been pushed out there, which there's something like 40 public comments, and that period closed in February. But over the couple of months, they collected comments. Several of those are from medical device companies, traditional medical device companies, and or advocacy groups. And you definitely get that same flavor that they're interested to see that the playing field is level and that they want to be playing at the same level as the hospital. If the hospital can do something and kind of skirt regulatory implications, that doesn't seem fair. Interestingly, the FDA is, in looking at patient safety, they want a patient to be able to walk into a medical facility and get care and not have to worry about whether the care they're going to get was made there. Let's say they're going to go for a shoulder implant. They don't want the patient to have to worry about whether that implant was made on site or whether that implant was bought from industry. And to me, the industry rightly pointed out that same issue, that from a safety standpoint, they have to go through all kinds of hoops, and that hospitals, if they're doing the same work, should go through those same set of procedures. I think there are lots of different viewpoints. I think some of that is maybe looking ahead to implants, which I think is really somewhat far ahead. I don't think there's a whole lot of fear about hospitals making a bunch of their own implants, but I do think the area of kind of personalized surgery, where you've got either models or surgical guides and templates, which are very commonly used these days, there is this concept that the medical device companies want to continue to remain prominent in this area and want to make sure that the playing field is level.
It's all very interesting. A lot of interesting evolutions in the coming years, like in the field of the surgical guides and kind of things are obviously where Materialize is also very, very curious to see where the needle will go. Final question to you, Andy. Like, obviously you had already quite an interesting journey in 3D printing. Looking ahead, what does the future bring for you?
I hope to continue to contribute. I definitely kind of enjoy seeing where things are going and trying to play some role in putting pieces together to push it forward. So I'd say for me, I'm very interested kind of academically in helping move forward the concept of reimbursement for these types of products in the U.S. So to me, it's important that we're now on a path. I'd love to see it progress to something positive at the end of that path. The other part of me today is kind of advising and helping companies of mostly small companies, and many of them in the 3D printing space, trying to see these companies kind of reach potential as well. So I enjoy being a kind of strategic team member, helping companies kind of navigate either the regulatory side of things or just business, trying to figure out how to get products out to market and, how to compete effectively. That to me, I think, is where I will be, spending more time. I sit on a few boards and I enjoy that work and do some investing, and enjoyed seeing other people with passion. If I think of myself and passion and energy from, say, 30 years ago, people that are really passionate about doing something and changing the world, being able to contribute somehow to seeing those dreams manifest is exciting. I think otherwise, I've definitely enjoyed over the last years having more time to spend with my family. And I've got a son who's now 17, and his first 10 years, it was challenging running a business and kind of growing an enterprise, and challenging to kind of be all that I wanted to be from a father standpoint as well. I feel like I was kind of given a gift of being able to spend more time personally with family during this last few years. It's a long game. I mean, it's interesting to see how all these things tie together. Thinking back to, I think we all stand on the shoulders of giants. One of those giants for me, for sure, is Fried von Crane, Materialize founder, who in 1990 or thereabouts really did things and created software tools that enabled the rest of us to do what we did. I think for me, it's great to see Fried and Materialize playing such a leading role still in kind of pushing forward these topics and not not just thinking about customization for a couple of people, but thinking about it for the masses. What's holding us back from offering these tools to lots and lots more people? So exciting things ahead.
I think we learned a whole lot of things. Maybe to recap a few, I think for me was very insightful to think about history and how 3D printing became more accessible and therefore also became available at the point of care. I think you described that quite well. Also today, how we're handling reimbursement as a way to make it sustainable in the longer term and bring it to more patients as well. And then also thinking about the future, about where the next generation of, well, whether it's metal printing or regenerative medicine, how 3D printing will play a role and how it will contribute. So all that was, I think, pretty exciting to talk about. Thanks, Andy. We appreciate you sharing your insights with us on 3D Players, a podcast where we explore trends, insights, and innovations in personalized and sustainable healthcare. We were your hosts, Sebastian de Brood and Pieter Slagmolen. Thank you for listening and join us for the next edition.